May 12, 1942. Hans Müller sat on an ammunition crate outside his tent pen, hovering over paper. Around him, 200 men of the 389th Infantry Division were preparing to move east. Someone was singing. Someone else was cleaning a rifle. The air smelled like diesel and coffee. Hans wrote, "Dear Mother and Father, we have received new winter coats." He stopped, crossed it out, started again. "Dear Mother and Father, the officers say we'll be home by Christmas." A shadow fell across the page. Feldwebel Otto Rahn stood there, cigarette dangling from his lips, 35 years old, and looking 50. Writing home. "Yes, Feldwebel." "What are you telling them?" "That we'll be home by Christmas." Otto laughed, bitter and short. "Sure you will. In a box, maybe." Hans looked up, startled. "The Führer said." "The Führer," Otto interrupted, "is in Berlin. We're going to Russia." He walked away before Hans could respond. Hans stared at the unfinished letter. His hand was steady. He believed every word he was about to write. He had to. "Dear Mother and Father, we have received new winter coats, though I hope we won't need them. The officers say we'll be home by Christmas. I miss you both. Your loving son, Hans." He folded it sealed. It handed it to the postal clerk. 3 weeks later, his mother would read it in their kitchen in Cologne and cry with relief. By then, Hans would be 400 kilometers deeper into Russia, and the word Christmas would taste like ash in his mouth. The Sixth Army moved like a machine. 270,000 men, 3,000 trucks, 500 tanks. They rolled east through Ukraine under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Hans rode in the back of a supply truck with 9 other men, all of them younger than 25, all of them convinced they were invincible. "How long do you think it'll take?" asked a boy named Klaus, 17 years old, fresh from Hamburg. "The Führer said 6 weeks, another replied. "My cousin was at Moscow last year. He said the Russians just run away." Hans said nothing. He watched the endless wheat fields pass by, golden and swaying, and thought about his father's bookshop. Before the war, he'd spent every evening there reading Goethe and Schiller, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Now he was holding a rifle, heading toward a city he couldn't even pronounce correctly. "Stalingrad," Otto had said during the briefing. "Industrial city. Lots of factories. Lots of Reds. We go in, we clean them out. We move on." Simple. Clean. Surgical. Hans wanted to believe it. June 28th. The Don River. The Sixth Army stopped to regroup. Hans stood at the water's edge watching the current. Behind him, thousands of men were digging in, setting up artillery, preparing for the final push. Klaus appeared beside him, boots sinking into the mud. "Is that it? Is that Stalingrad?" Hans squinted east. Smoke rose in the distance, thin columns against the horizon. "That's where we're going," Otto said, joining them. He spat into the river. "How far?" Klaus asked. 100 kilometers, maybe less." "That's nothing." "Sure," Otto said. "Nothing." He lit a cigarette, hands cupped against the wind. "Tell me something, boy. You ever kill anyone?" Klaus hesitated. "Not yet." "You will." Otto took a long drag. "And when you do, don't think about it. Don't remember their face. Don't ask yourself if they had a family. Just pull the trigger and move on. Understand?" Klaus nodded, pale. Otto turned to Hans. "What about you, Müller? You ready?" Hans opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't know." "Good. That's the first honest thing I've heard all week." Otto walked away, trailing smoke. That night, Hans tried to write another letter. He sat in his tent, listening to the sounds of 200 men settling in for sleep. Snoring, coughing, someone praying in whispers. He wrote, Dear mother, I'm scared. He stared at the words for 5 minutes. Then he tore the paper into pieces and started again. Dear mother and father, we are approaching Stalingrad. The weather is beautiful. I am well. Your loving son, Hans. Lies came easier than truth. He'd learned that already. July 17th. The first artillery shells fell on Stalingrad's outskirts. Hans heard them from 30 kilometers away, a distant thunder that rolled across the steppe like a storm. The men cheered. They thought it meant the war was almost over. By August 23rd, German tanks reached the Volga River north of the city. Hans saw the photographs. Soldiers posing beside the water, grinning arms around each other's shoulders. Victory, glory, history. His company wasn't there. The 389th Infantry Division was assigned to attack from the northwest through the industrial district. Factories and warehouses, steel and concrete. Why can't we go through the city center? Klaus asked during the briefing. The lieutenant didn't look up from his map. Because the Luftwaffe already burned it down. Nothing left there but rubble. We go where the Reds are. Where are they? Everywhere. August ended. September began. Hans didn't write home anymore. There was nothing to say that wouldn't terrify his mother or get censored by the postal officers. Instead, he kept a small notebook writing fragments when he could. September 3rd, reached the outskirts. City is burning. Smoke so thick I can taste it. September 7th, lost 2 men to snipers, didn't see where the shots came from. September 11th, Klaus asked me if I think we'll win. I didn't answer. September 13th, 0600 hours, Hans's company received orders to clear a residential block near the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. The briefing lasted 3 minutes. Suspected Red Army holdouts in the apartment complex. Estimated 10 to 15 combatants. Clear the building. Secure the perimeter. Move on. Simple. Clean. Surgical. They moved out at dawn. 12 men. Otto in front. Hans in the middle. Klaus at the rear. The apartment building loomed ahead, 4 stories of gray concrete windows like empty eyes. Otto raised his fist. Everyone stopped. Silence. Not even wind. I don't like this, someone whispered. Shut up, Otto hissed. They approached the entrance. The door hung crooked on broken hinges. Inside darkness. Otto went first. Hans followed, heart hammering so hard he thought everyone could hear it. The stairwell smelled like burnt wood and something else. Something sweet and rotten. They climbed to the 2nd floor. Otto signaled 2 men left, 2 men right, everyone else straight ahead. Hans went straight. Klaus stayed close behind him, breathing fast and shallow. They reached a doorway. Otto kicked it open. The machine gun opened fire before Hans even saw it. The noise was unbelievable. Not like training. Not like anything. The man in front of Otto went down, chest exploding red. Another man screamed and fell. Otto dove left. Hans threw himself right, slamming into a wall so hard his teeth clacked together. The machine gun kept firing. Plaster and brick dust filled the air. Someone was shouting in Russian. Someone else was crying in German. Grenade! Otto yelled. Hans pressed himself flat, hands over his head. The explosion sucked all the air from the room, replaced it with pressure and heat and ringing silence. Then more gunfire. Screaming. The wet sound of bullets hitting flesh. Hans couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. His training evaporated. He was 23 years old, lying in rubble, and he wanted his mother. Müller. Otto's voice cut through the chaos. Move now. Hans moved. He didn't decide to. His body just did it. He crawled forward, rifle clutched in shaking hands, dust coating his tongue. He reached a doorway, looked inside. A girl was reloading a rifle, maybe 19, dark hair, thin face. Her hands moved fast, practiced. She looked up. Saw him. For 1 second they stared at each other. Hans saw her eyes widen, saw her mouth open. He pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked into his shoulder. The girl jerked backward and fell. Just like that. One moment alive, the next moment, not. Hans stared at what he'd done. The rifle slipped from his hands. "Good shot," Otto said, appearing beside him. "Now move. We're not done." They weren't done. It took 4 more hours to clear that building. 8 Germans died, 15 wounded. The Soviets fought from every room, every closet, every corner. Some of them were soldiers, some weren't. When it was over, Hans sat on the floor in a room that used to be someone's kitchen. There was a table overturned, broken plates, a child's drawing on the wall, crayon flowers under a yellow sun. Otto sat beside him, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "First time?" Hans nodded. He couldn't speak. If he spoke, something would break inside him. "She would have killed you," Otto said. "I know." "Then why do you look like that?" "Like what?" "Like you just murdered someone." Hans turned to look at him. "Didn't I?" Otto wiped blood from his eyes, smearing it across his temple. "No, you killed an enemy combatant. There's a difference." "Is there?" Otto didn't answer. After a moment, he stood up, wincing. "Get some rest. We move again at dawn." That night, Hans tried to write home. He sat in a basement that smelled like cordite and blood notebook on his knees, pen in his hand. "Dear Mother and Father." He stopped. What could he say? That he'd killed someone, that she'd looked young enough to be his sister, that he could still see her eyes when he closed his. He wrote, "We are still in Stalingrad. It is taking longer than expected. Please send warm socks." He didn't mention the girl. Some truths were too heavy to carry home. September ended. October came. Hans's company shrank from 180 men to 90, then to 60. Fresh replacements arrived every week. Boys of 17 and 18 with clean uniforms and bright eyes. Hans stopped learning their names. It was easier that way. October 14th. The Germans launched their largest offensive yet. 90,000 men, 300 tanks, 2,000 artillery pieces, all concentrated on the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. Hans's unit attacked at dawn. The factory was hell made solid. Twisted steel girders, collapsed walls. Smoke so thick you couldn't see 3 meters ahead. They advanced room by room, meter by meter. Soviet snipers fired from the wreckage. Machine guns appeared and disappeared like ghosts. By noon, they'd captured the main assembly hall. 30 men dead to take one building. Hans stood in what used to be a production line. Bodies everywhere. German, Soviet. Some so burned he couldn't tell which. A destroyed T-34 tank sat in the corner, its crew still inside, cooked like meat. Klaus was beside him, pale and shaking. "We won, right? We took it." Otto spat blood. "Sure, we took it." "Then why are you laughing?" "Because, kid, we'll lose it again tomorrow, and we'll take it back the day after, and we'll keep taking and losing this same goddamn building until we're all dead." Klaus stared at him. "You're lying." "Am I?" Otto pointed at the bodies. "Those men died taking this factory 3 days ago. The Reds took it back. Now we took it again. How many times do you want to die for the same pile of bricks?" Klaus didn't answer. He walked away, shoulders shaking. Hans stayed. He needed to hear something else. He needed to hear the truth. Did he? Otto looked at him, eyes hollow. "When did you stop being naive?" "September 13th, about 3 seconds after I shot that girl." "Good. Now you might actually survive." They held the factory for 3 days. Then the Soviets counterattacked and took half of it back in a single night. The battle became a loop. Attack, capture, defend, lose, attack again. Days blurred into nights. Hans forgot what month it was, forgot what day, almost forgot what he was fighting for. Almost. October 28th. Hans sat in a frozen cellar with 9 other men. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. Outside, the temperature was dropping. Winter was coming. Hans pulled out his notebook. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen. "Writing home again?" Otto asked. He was sitting across from him, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. Trying to. What are you going to tell them? Hans stared at the blank page. I don't know. Tell them you're scared. Tell them you want to come home. Tell them the truth. I can't. Why not? Because it'll hurt them. Otto laughed harsh and bitter. You think lying hurts them less? You think they don't know? Hans pressed the pen to paper. His hand trembled. Dear mother and father. Wait. Otto leaned forward. You really want to write something that matters? Yes. Then write this, I'm alive. That's all. I'm alive. Hans looked at him. Otto's face was gaunt eyes, sunken lips cracked from cold. He looked like a corpse already. Are we? Hans asked quietly. Are we alive? Otto didn't answer. Instead, he started singing. An old German folk song about fields and home and summer. His voice was rough off-key, but steady. Why are you singing? Hans asked. Because if I don't, I'll start screaming. Hans understood. He bent over his notebook and wrote, Dear mother and father, we are still fighting. I cannot describe what it is like. Please pray for me. Your son Hans. He folded it, sealed it. The letter would never reach Cologne. 3 days later, on November 1st, the postal service would collapse entirely. But Hans didn't know that yet. He sat in the darkness listening to Otto sing and tried to remember what peace felt like. Somewhere above them, snow began to fall. The first snow of winter. Soft and silent, covering the ruins, covering the dead, covering everything. And far to the northwest and south beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of German scouts and reconnaissance, 2 Soviet armies were moving into position. Operation Uranus. Over 1 million men. 3,000 tanks. 13,000 artillery pieces. The trap was closing. The Sixth Army didn't know it yet. They were too busy fighting for buildings, for streets, for meters of frozen ground. Hans put his notebook away and closed his eyes. In the darkness, he heard Otto's voice singing about home. And for just a moment, he let himself believe they might actually see it again. But in his heart, in the place where truth lived, he already knew better. November 2nd, 1942. Hans woke to silence. Not the usual silence of exhausted men sleeping. This was different, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. He sat up in the cellar joints, cracking from cold. Around him, 8 men lay curled in blankets that were more holes than fabric. Otto was awake, staring at nothing. You hear that? Otto whispered. I don't hear anything. Exactly. Hans listened. No artillery, no gunfire, no aircraft overhead. For the first time in 2 months, Stalingrad was quiet. What does it mean? Hans asked. Otto's jaw tightened. Nothing good. At 0730 hours, the order came down: all units report to battalion headquarters immediately. Hans's company assembled in the ruins of what used to be a school. 37 men left. In August, they'd been 180. The battalion commander stood on a pile of rubble, face gray. Gentlemen, I won't lie to you. Yesterday, Soviet forces broke through our Romanian allies north and south of the city. As of this morning, we are surrounded. Silence. Not even breathing. Klaus raised his hand, voice cracking. Surrounded, all of us. The entire Sixth Army. 270,000 men. General Paulus has requested permission to break out. The Führer has ordered us to hold position. Someone laughed, high and sharp, on the edge of hysteria. The commander continued. The Luftwaffe will supply us by air until relief forces arrive. Rations will be reduced to preserve. How long? Otto interrupted. Excuse me. How long until relief arrives? The commander looked at him. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And if it doesn't, then we hold until it does. The commander climbed down from the rubble. Dismissed. The men stood there, nobody moving. Hans felt something cold slide down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Klaus turned to him, eyes too bright. 2 weeks. That's nothing. We can last 2 weeks. Hans didn't answer. He looked at Otto, who was staring at the gray sky like he could see through it. Feldwebel? Otto spat. Start counting your bullets, boy. We're going to need them. By November 10th, the rations had been cut in half. By November 15th, cut in half again. The Luftwaffe supply flights came sporadically, weather permitting, dropping crates that often landed in Soviet-controlled territory or shattered on impact. Hans's company received 1 loaf of bread per day. 37 men. 1 loaf. They divided it with a ruler and a knife. Each man got exactly 4.3 centimeters. Anyone caught stealing faced immediate execution. It happened twice in the first week. Hans chewed his portion slowly, making it last. The bread was frozen solid. He had to hold it in his mouth until it thawed enough to swallow. It tasted like sawdust and mold, but it was food, and food was everything. Klaus sat beside him, staring at his own piece. My mother makes apple cake, every Sunday, with cinnamon and sugar. I can smell it. Can you smell it? No. I can, right now. I can smell it. Klaus's hands were shaking. He'd lost 15 kilos in 3 weeks. His uniform hung on him like a tent. Eat your bread, Hans said quietly. I'm saving it for later. Eat it now. You might not have a later. Klaus looked at him, and for a moment Hans saw real fear. Not the fear of bullets or bombs, the fear of understanding. We're not getting out, are we? Klaus whispered. Hans wanted to lie, wanted to say something reassuring, something hopeful, but he'd used up all his lies writing letters home. I don't know. Otto says we're all going to die here. Otto says a lot of things, but he's always right. Hans couldn't argue with that. He ate his bread and said nothing. November 23rd, Hans's company was ordered to hold a section of the tractor factory they'd already captured and lost 4 times. The Soviets attacked at dawn. 200 men against 30. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, 23 Germans were left standing. Klaus wasn't one of them. Hans found him in the factory's basement, propped against a wall, hands pressed to his stomach. Blood leaked through his fingers, black in the dim light. Müller. Klaus's voice was small, childlike. Hans knelt beside him. I'm here. I can't feel my legs. Don't talk. Save your strength. For what? Klaus coughed. Blood speckled his lips. I'm 17. I never even kissed a girl. Hans didn't know what to say. There was nothing to say. Tell my mother, Klaus whispered. Tell her I wasn't scared. I will. You're lying. Yes. Klaus smiled just a little. Thank you. His eyes closed. His hands stopped pressing. The blood kept coming. Hans sat there until Otto found him 20 minutes later. He's gone, Otto said. I know. We need to move. Reds are regrouping. Hans stood up. His legs felt hollow. How many more? How many more what? How many more are going to die in this goddamn factory? Otto looked at Klaus's body, then at Hans. All of us. Eventually. They left Klaus there. There was no time for burial, no energy for prayers. The factory had become a graveyard where the dead outnumbered the living, and the living envied the dead. December arrived like a punishment. The temperature dropped to -20 Celsius, then -30. The Volga River froze solid. Men's fingers turned black with frostbite. Sentries froze to death at their posts, rifles still in their hands. Hans's company had shrunk to 14 men. They lived in a basement that used to be a cafeteria. The kitchen equipment was still there, massive steel ovens and prep tables, all useless now. They burned furniture for warmth, then floorboards, then pieces of the walls. On December 8th, they received their ration half a loaf of bread for 14 men. Someone had done the math. 35 grams per person. One slice. Otto divided it with surgical precision. Each man watched the knife like it was cutting diamonds. A soldier named Werner spoke up voice hoarse. "I'll trade my bread for a cigarette." "Nobody has cigarettes," someone replied. "Then I'll trade it for anything. A letter from home, a photograph, a memory." Werner was crying. "I just want something that isn't this." Nobody answered. What could they say? They'd all had that thought. They were all thinking it right now. Hans took his portion and moved to the corner as far from the others as possible. He couldn't stand watching them eat. Couldn't stand the sounds they made, the desperate chewing, the way they licked their fingers afterward to catch every crumb. He pulled out his notebook. His last one. The others had been burned for warmth. This one he'd hidden in his boot, pressed against his skin. "Dear Mother and Father, I am still alive." His hand cramped. He had to stop, flex his fingers, try again. "I know it has been weeks since my last letter. Mail service is difficult. I want you to know that I think of you every day. I think of home. I think of the bookshop and Sunday dinners and everything I took for granted." He paused. Ink was precious. Paper was precious. Every word had to count. "If I don't come home, please know that I loved you both. Please know that I tried." He couldn't finish. His throat closed up. He folded the paper and put it away. The letter would never be sent anyway. The last postal flight had been 3 weeks ago. Otto sat down beside him, moving like an old man. He was 35 but looked 60. His face was skeletal, eyes sunken deep. "Still writing. Still pretending to." "Good. Pretending is important. Keeps you human." "Does it?" Hans looked at him. "I don't feel human anymore. I feel like an animal. All I think about is food and warmth and not dying. Is that human?" Otto was quiet for a long time. Finally he said, "You know what I miss most?" "What?" "Coffee. Real coffee. Not this ersatz garbage. I had a cafe near my apartment in Berlin. Every morning I'd get a cup before work. The owner knew my name. He'd have it ready when I walked in." Otto closed his eyes. "I can taste it. I swear to God, I can taste it right now." "What was his name, the owner?" "Hermann. Old guy. Made the best coffee in Berlin." Otto opened his eyes. "He was Jewish. I never told anyone. When they came for him in 38, I pretended I didn't know. I just stopped going to that cafe. Found a different one." Hans stared at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm dying, and I need to tell someone." Otto's voice cracked. "I need someone to know that I was a coward before I was a soldier. That I failed to be human when it actually mattered." "You're not dying. We're all dying. Some of us just know it better than others." December 16th. A single transport aircraft managed to land inside the pocket. It brought 300 kilos of supplies for 270,000 men. The crew unloaded and immediately tried to take off again, but the plane's landing gear had frozen. Word spread fast. Wounded men began crawling toward the airfield, dragging themselves through snow, leaving trails of blood. They'd heard the crew was evacuating casualties. They'd heard there was room for 20 men. There were 4,000 wounded. Hans watched from half a kilometer away. He could hear them screaming, fighting, begging. The crew finally got the plane started and taxied for takeoff. Men clung to the wings. Some fell off. Some didn't. The plane lifted off with 37 people crammed inside. It crashed 2 kilometers outside the pocket, hit by Soviet anti-aircraft fire. There were no survivors. Hans turned away and vomited. Nothing came up. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. "Don't look," Otto said beside him. "I can't help it." "Yes, you can. You have to, because if you keep looking at things like that, you'll lose your mind and we need you sane." "Why?" "What difference does it make?" Otto grabbed his shoulder fingers, digging in hard. Because sanity is the last thing they can't take from us. The Reds can take our food, our ammunition, our lives, but they can't take our minds unless we give them up. Understand. Hans nodded, not because he understood, but because Otto needed him to. December 24th, Christmas Eve. The German radio broadcast a special program, Messages from Home. Carol singing. A speech from Goebbels about courage and sacrifice and final victory. Hans's company gathered around a radio someone had salvaged. 12 men now. 2 had died in the night, frozen in their sleep. The broadcast crackled with static. A choir sang Silent Night. Some of the men sang along, voices rough and breaking. Hans sat apart, unable to sing, unable to do anything but exist. Otto moved next to him, carrying something wrapped in newspaper. Merry Christmas. What is it? Open it. Hans unwrapped the paper. Inside was half a potato, raw and frozen solid. Where did you get this? Don't ask questions you don't want answered. Otto pulled out his own half. I figured we should have something. You know, for tradition. Hans stared at the potato. It was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in months. I can't take this. Shut up and eat. They ate in silence, making each bite last. The potato was bitter and hard as stone, but it was food, and it was Christmas, and for one moment, they weren't dying soldiers in a frozen hell. They were just 2 men sharing a meal. When Hans finished, he said, "Thank you." For what? For pretending we're still human. Otto smiled just barely. Who says we're pretending? On the radio, the choir finished their song. The announcer's voice came through warm and confident. Our brave soldiers in Stalingrad remain steadfast. They await relief, certain of German victory. The Führer has promised that no German soldier will be forgotten. Someone turned the radio off. In the silence that followed, Hans heard wind howling through broken walls, heard men breathing, heard the slow tick of his own heartbeat. He pulled out his notebook one last time and wrote, December 24th, 1942. We are 12. We have no food, no ammunition, no hope. But we are still here. We are still breathing. I don't know if that makes us brave or just too stubborn to die. I don't know if anyone will ever read this. But if they do, I want them to know we didn't give up. Even when everything was lost, even when the world forgot about us, we didn't give up. He closed the notebook and held it against his chest. Outside, snow fell in sheets, burying the dead, covering the ruins, erasing all evidence that anyone had ever fought here at all. But inside that basement, in the darkness and cold, 12 men sat together and refused to disappear. They had lost everything else, but they kept that. The stubborn, irrational insistence on continuing to exist. And for one more night, that was enough. By January 1943, time stopped meaning anything. Days bled into nights without distinction. The only markers left were the dead. Hans woke on January 8th to find Werner frozen beside him. Not dead from wounds or starvation, just frozen. Werner had gone to sleep and never woken up. His eyes were still open, frost coating his eyelashes like tiny crystals. "Help me move him," Otto said. They dragged Werner outside and laid him with the others, 17 bodies in a row, stiff as mannequins. Nobody said prayers anymore. There wasn't time, and prayers didn't change anything. When they came back inside, 10 men were left. A corporal named Schmidt was sitting against the wall, counting on his fingers. Over and over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Back to 1. Again. "Schmidt," Otto said. "You all right?" Schmidt looked up, eyes unfocused. "I'm trying to remember. How many days has it been? Since what? Since we got surrounded?" Otto thought about it. 67 days. That's not possible. It can't be 67 days. We've only been here a few weeks. It's been 67 days. Schmidt started laughing, high and wild and wrong. 67 days. 67 days. They said relief would come in 2 weeks. They said the Luftwaffe would supply us. They said we'd be home by Christmas. His laughter turned into sobbing. They lied. They lied about everything. Nobody contradicted him. What was the point? Hans moved to the corner and sat down. His body felt wrong. Too light, like he was made of paper instead of flesh. He could see his own ribs through his uniform. Could count each one. Otto joined him, moving with the careful slowness of someone much older. You need to eat something. There's nothing to eat. The ration comes at noon. Hans laughed bitter. You mean our 20 grams of bread? That's not eating. That's dying slower. Slower is still better than faster. Is it? Hans looked at him. Werner died in his sleep. He didn't suffer. He just stopped. Maybe that's better. Maybe we should all just stop. Otto's hand shot out and grabbed Hans's jaw, forcing him to look up. His grip was weak but desperate. Don't say that. Don't even think it. Why not? It's true. Because the moment you accept death, you're already gone. I've seen it happen. Men just sit down and quit. Stop eating. Stop talking. Stop trying. And then they're dead, even if their hearts are still beating. Otto released him. Promise me you won't do that. I can't promise anything. Promise me anyway. Hans wanted to refuse. Wanted to tell Otto that promises were luxuries for people who had futures. But something in Otto's face stopped him. Fear. Real, raw fear. I promise, Hans whispered. Otto nodded and closed his eyes. Good. That's good. That afternoon the ration arrived. 18 grams of bread per man. Someone had scraped mold off the crust. The inside was green. They ate it anyway, every crumb, every speck. Schmidt didn't eat his portion. He just held it staring at it like he'd forgotten what it was for. Schmidt, Hans said. Eat. I'm not hungry. Eat anyway. What's the point? Schmidt's voice was flat, empty. We're all going to die here. Why prolong it? Otto leaned forward. Because prolonging is all we have. Because every hour we're alive is an hour the Reds don't get to claim victory. Because we're German soldiers, and German soldiers don't quit. German soldiers also don't starve in basements, while their commanders lie to them, Schmidt said. General Paulus said we'd be relieved. The Führer promised. Where are they? Where's the relief? Nobody answered. They all knew the truth. There was no relief coming. The Sixth Army was dying, and Berlin was already writing eulogies. Schmidt set his bread down and stood up. I'm going outside. It's -30, Otto said. I know. You'll freeze. I know. Schmidt walked toward the stairs. At the doorway, he stopped and turned back. Tell my wife I thought about her at the end. Tell her I'm sorry I didn't come home. Then he was gone. They heard him climb the stairs, heard the door open and close. Nobody went after him. What would be the point? Otto picked up Schmidt's bread and divided it among the remaining 9 men. 2 extra grams each. They ate in silence, trying not to think about the price of those extra grams. Hans pulled out his notebook. The pages were almost gone. He'd burned most of them to boil snow for drinking water. Only 3 sheets remained. He wrote, January 8th, 1943. We are 9. Schmidt walked into the cold. Werner froze in his sleep. I think about death constantly now. Not in a frightened way. In a curious way. Like wondering what's around a corner. Otto says that's dangerous thinking. He says I need to stay focused on living. But I don't remember what living feels like anymore. He stopped writing. Ink was nearly gone too. He'd been watering it down with snowmelt, stretching it as far as possible. Soon there would be nothing left to write with. Nothing left to write on. Nothing left to say. Müller. Hans looked up. A runner had appeared in the doorway. A boy, maybe 16, wearing a uniform 3 sizes too big. Orders from battalion. Your squad is assigned to Perimeter Defense Sector 7. Report immediately. Otto stood up. Sector 7. That's exposed. No cover. Those are the orders, Feldwebel. How many men are holding that sector now? The runner hesitated. None. They all died last night. Soviet probe. And you want us to replace them? 9 half-dead men. I'm just delivering orders. The runner turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. He left before anyone could respond. The 9 men looked at each other. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. They all understood what Sector 7 meant. It was a death sentence with extra steps. Finally, Otto stood. Get your rifles. We move in 5 minutes. Are you serious? Someone asked. Do I look like I'm joking? We'll die out there. We'll die in here too. At least out there we'll die doing our jobs. Otto checked his rifle. The bolt was frozen. He had to bang it against the wall to get it moving. 5 minutes. Move. They moved. Because soldiers move when ordered. Because habit is stronger than logic. Because doing something felt better than sitting and waiting to freeze. Sector 7 was a stretch of rubble 200 meters long, overlooking what used to be a railway yard. No fortifications, no trenches. Just collapsed walls and frozen corpses from the last unit that had tried to hold it. Hans took position behind a pile of bricks that came up to his chest. Not enough cover to matter, but enough to feel slightly less exposed. Otto was 10 meters to his left. The others spread out along the line. The temperature was -32. Hans's fingers went numb in seconds. He tried to work the bolt on his rifle. It moved but slowly. If the Soviets attacked, he'd get maybe 1 shot before his weapon froze solid. Contact! Someone shouted. Hans looked up. Movement in the ruins ahead. Figures in white winter camouflage barely visible against the snow. Hold fire, Otto commanded. Wait until they're close. The figures advanced. 50 meters. 40. 30. Fire. Hans pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Frozen solid. All around him the same problem. Rifles clicking uselessly. One man managed to fire a single shot before his weapon jammed. The Soviets opened up with submachine guns. The sound was enormous. Bullets shattered bricks threw up clouds of ice and dust. Hans dove flat, pressing himself into the frozen ground. Someone screamed. Someone else went silent, mid-scream. Fall back, Otto was yelling. Fall back to secondary position. Hans scrambled backward, dragging his useless rifle. He reached cover behind a larger wall just as a grenade exploded where he'd been lying. The blast picked him up and threw him 3 meters. He landed hard, stars exploding behind his eyes. When his vision cleared, Otto was dragging him by his collar. Get up. Move. Hans got up. Ran. Fell. Got up again. They made it back to the basement. 6 of them now. 3 left behind in Sector 7 dead or dying. Otto slammed the door and barricaded it with a table. Check your ammo. Hans checked. 2 rounds left. His rifle was still frozen. I've got 3, someone said. 1. None. Otto had 4 bullets. 10 rounds total among 6 men. That was a probe, Otto said. They were testing our strength. They'll come back tonight with more men. When they do, we won't be able to stop them. So what do we do? Hans asked. We survive until morning. Then we figure out tomorrow. And if they come back, then we do what we've been doing for 2 months. We fight with whatever we have until we can't fight anymore. That night, Hans sat with his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, waiting for an attack that might or might not come. Beside him, a soldier named Koch was crying quietly. I want my mother, Koch whispered. I just want my mother. Hans said nothing. What could he say? That everything would be okay, that they'd survive this. Those were lies, and everyone knew it. Instead, he reached over and put his hand on Koch's shoulder. Just that. A simple touch. Connection. proof that neither of them was alone. Coke's crying slowly stopped. After a while, he fell asleep, head tilted back against the wall. Hans stayed awake, keeping watch. Not because orders required it, but because if Coke was going to sleep, someone needed to make sure he'd wake up again. Otto appeared beside him, moving like a ghost. "You should rest." "Can't." "Why not?" "If I close my eyes, I might not open them again." Otto sat down with a grunt. "I've been thinking about my son." Hans looked at him surprised. "You have a son?" "He'll be 8 now, maybe 9. I lose track." Otto stared at the darkness. "Before the war, I used to read to him every night. Adventure stories. Knights and dragons and heroes who always won." "What was his name?" "Peter." Otto's voice cracked on the name. "I haven't thought about him in months. Tried not to. It hurt too much. But tonight, I can't stop." "What will you tell him when you get home?" "I'm not going home." "You don't know that." Otto turned to look at him. "Yes, I do. And so do you. We've known it since November. We just didn't want to say it out loud." He paused. "But I need you to do something for me." "What?" "If by some miracle you survive and I don't find my family, tell Peter that his father thought about him every day. Tell him I'm sorry I didn't come home." "Stop," Hans said. "You're not dying. Promise me." "Otto, promise me." Hans closed his eyes. "I promise." Otto nodded slowly. "Thank you." He stood up, joints popping. "I'm going to check the perimeter." He walked away before Hans could respond. Hans sat there listening to Coke's breathing, listening to the wind howl through broken walls, listening to his own heartbeat. And he thought about promises, about all the promises he'd made and broken, about the promises others had made to him, about how promises were just words, and words didn't stop bullets or cold or hunger. But sometimes, in the deepest dark words, were all anyone had. January 10th. A supply drop. The first in 12 days. 6 containers parachuted into the pocket. 2 landed in Soviet territory. 3 shattered on impact. 1 survived. Inside ammunition. No food. No medicine. Just bullets. The distribution officer looked at the crate like it was a sick joke. "What are we supposed to do with this? We can barely hold our rifles and they send us bullets." But they took them anyway. Because bullets were better than nothing. Because somewhere in Berlin, someone had decided bullets mattered more than bread. Hans received 10 rounds. He loaded them into his rifle with fingers that barely worked, and he tried not to think about what those 10 rounds meant. That someone expected him to use them. That someone expected him to keep fighting. That someone somewhere still believed the Sixth Army could be saved. But Hans knew better. They all knew better. The Sixth Army wasn't an army anymore. It was a ghost haunting the ruins of Stalingrad, waiting for someone to finally let it rest. January 15th. 5 men left. Coke had died in the night. Pneumonia. Or starvation. Or just exhaustion from the effort of living. It didn't matter which. Dead was dead. Hans helped carry him outside. They laid him with the others, a row that now stretched 30 meters. 30 meters of frozen corpses, all of them wearing the same uniform, all of them forgotten by everyone except the men, still alive to count them. When Hans came back inside, Otto was sitting alone in the corner. He wasn't moving, just sitting, staring at his hands. Feldwebel. No response. Hans sat down beside him. "Otto, talk to me." "I killed a child," Otto said quietly. Hans went cold. "What?" "In Poland, 1939. We were clearing a village. There was a boy maybe 12. He had a rifle, an old hunting rifle, probably his grandfather's." Otto's voice was flat. "He pointed it at us. My lieutenant ordered me to shoot. So I did. 1 bullet. Center mass. He dropped like a stone." Why are you telling me this? Because I need to tell someone before I die. I need someone to know what I did. Otto looked at him, eyes hollow. The boy's mother came running out, started screaming. My lieutenant shot her too. Said we couldn't leave witnesses. Hans didn't know what to say. What could anyone say to that? I tell myself it was war. Otto continued. I tell myself I was following orders. I tell myself the boy would have shot first. But none of that changes what I did. None of that makes it right. Why now? Why tell me this now? Because we're dying, and I don't want to die carrying this alone. Otto's hands were shaking. I want someone to remember. I want someone to know that before I became this thing, this frozen corpse waiting to happen, I was a man who did something unforgivable. And I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. Hans put his hand on Otto's shoulder. It was all he could offer. Absolution wasn't his to give. They sat together in the darkness, two men carrying impossible weights, waiting for an end that was taking too long to arrive. Outside, snow continued to fall, burying evidence, covering sins, erasing history, one flake at a time. But inside that basement, in the cold and hunger and despair, the truth remained, spoken aloud, witnessed, remembered, and for whatever it was worth, neither man was alone with it anymore. January 22nd, 1943. The radio crackled to life at dawn. Hans jerked awake, heart pounding. They hadn't heard anything on that radio in days except static and ghost signals from stations that no longer existed. Otto was already awake, staring at the device like it might explode. A voice came through, distorted and breaking. All units 6th Army, General Paulus orders. Prepare for final defensive positions. Relief operation has been unsuccessful. Maintain discipline. Heil Hitler. Then static again. The four remaining men sat in silence. The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence read aloud. That's it then, someone whispered. A private named Vogel, 20 years old, who'd stopped talking 3 days ago and had just now found his voice again. That's it, Otto confirmed. No relief, no rescue, nothing? Nothing. Vogel started laughing. Not the hysterical kind from before. This was different. Quiet and resigned, and somehow worse. My father said the Wehrmacht never abandons its soldiers. He said that before I left. Made me promise to be brave. He looked at his hands. I want to tell him he was wrong. I want to see his face when I tell him the Führer let us die here. You won't get that chance, Otto said flatly. I know. Vogel stopped laughing. That's the funny part. We all know. We've known for weeks, but hearing it on the radio somehow makes it real. Hans pulled out his notebook. 1 page left. Half a page, really. He'd burned the rest last night to boil snow. He wrote, January 22nd. They've stopped lying to us. That almost feels like mercy. His handwriting was barely legible. The pencil kept slipping from his fingers. He'd lost all feeling in his hands 2 days ago. Could barely make a fist anymore. What are you writing? Otto asked. I don't know. Something. Anything. Hans looked at the words. They meant nothing and everything. If I stop writing, it means I've given up. You should give up. We all should. Then why haven't you? Otto didn't answer. He stood up, joints cracking like breaking ice, and moved to the doorway. Outside, dawn was breaking. Gray light filtering through gray ruins under a gray sky. Because I'm too stubborn, Otto finally said. Because my son needs to know his father didn't quit. Because maybe somewhere in this frozen hell, stubbornness counts for something. A shell exploded 3 blocks away. The ground shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. Nobody flinched. They'd stopped flinching in December. January 24th. Soviet loudspeakers blared across no man's land. A woman's voice speaking German, clear and precise. German soldiers, your situation is hopeless. General Paulus has been promoted to field marshal. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. You know what this means. You have been sacrificed. Your commanders have abandoned you. Surrender now, and you will be fed. You will receive medical care. You will survive this war." The message repeated every hour, over and over, same words, same voice, mechanical and relentless. Hans listened from his position in the basement. The words made sense. Perfect, logical sense. Why die for leaders who'd already written them off? Why starve when the enemy promised food? "Don't even think about it," Otto said. "I wasn't." "Yes, you were. I can see it in your face." Hans looked at him. What if she's telling the truth? She probably is. The Reds have food, we don't. The math is simple. Then why not surrender? Because the moment we do, we become traitors. And if by some miracle any of us survive this war, they'll shoot us for cowardice. Otto lit a cigarette, his last one. He'd been saving it for weeks. Besides, do you really think the Reds will treat us well? We killed their families, burned their cities. You think they'll forgive that? Hans had no answer. Every choice led to death. Surrender or fight, freeze or starve, the destination was the same. Only the route changed. That night Vogel disappeared. Hans woke at 0300 and found his position empty. No note, no explanation, just gone. "He went over," Otto said. He was sitting by the window watching the darkness. "How do you know?" "Because I watched him. Saw him crawl out into no man's land. Saw him wave a white cloth. Saw the Reds take him." "Why didn't you stop him?" "Why should I? He made his choice. We should report it." Otto laughed, harsh and bitter. "Report it to who?" "There's 3 of us left. There's no chain of command anymore. There's no army. There's just us sitting in a basement waiting to die." Hans wanted to argue, but couldn't. Otto was right. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist as a functional unit. What remained were fragments. Individual soldiers clinging to life out of habit. The third man, a corporal named Bauer, spoke up from his corner. "I'm going too." "What?" Hans turned to him. "Tomorrow morning. I'm surrendering." Bauer's voice was calm, decided. "I'm 22 years old. I want to see 23. That's worth being called a traitor." "They'll shoot you," Otto said. "Maybe. Maybe not. But I know what happens if I stay here. At least surrender gives me a chance." Otto said nothing, just smoked his cigarette and stared into the darkness. Bauer left at dawn. Hans and Otto watched him go, watched him stumble through the rubble, hands raised, white cloth tied to a stick. Watched Soviet soldiers emerge and surround him, watched them lead him away. "You think he'll make it?" Hans asked. "No." "Why not?" "Because the universe isn't kind. Because mercy is a myth. Because we're all dead, and some of us just haven't stopped moving yet." Otto crushed out his cigarette. "It's just us now. Just us. 2 men in a frozen basement in a dead city fighting a lost war for an empire that had already forgotten them." Hans should have felt despair, should have felt terror. Instead, he felt nothing. Numbness had become a kind of armor, protection against reality. January 26th. Artillery pounded their sector all day. The Soviets were preparing for a final push. Hans and Otto took turns on watch rifles ready, knowing the weapons were almost useless. Frozen mechanisms. 3 bullets between them, but holding the rifles made them feel like soldiers instead of corpses. That evening a runner appeared. Actually appeared. Hans thought he was hallucinating until the boy spoke. "Orders from command. All remaining units fall back to the city center. Consolidation for final defense." Otto stared at him. "What command?" "There is no command. General Paulus requests all soldiers report to. Paulus is in a bunker somewhere drinking the last of the wine while we eat our boots." Otto's voice was ice. "Tell him to come here and deliver his orders himself." The runner's face went white. "I'm just delivering." "Get out." Otto raised his rifle. "Get out before I waste one of my 3 bullets on you." The runner fled. Hans watched him go. We should follow orders. Why? What's the point? Fall back to die somewhere else. At least here we know the terrain. Maybe there's actually a plan. There's no plan. There's never been a plan. Just old men moving markers on maps while we bleed. Otto sat down heavily. We stay here. We die here. At least we die on our terms. January 28th. The temperature dropped to -37. Hans couldn't feel his feet anymore. Hadn't felt them in days. When he looked down, his boots were white with frost. He didn't take them off to check. Didn't want to see what was underneath. Talk to me, Otto said. About what? Anything. I need to hear a human voice. Hans thought for a moment. Tell me about your son again. Peter. Otto's face softened just barely. He loved trains. Before the war, I'd take him to the station every Sunday. We'd watch them arrive and depart. He'd ask where they were going. I'd make up stories. Adventures in distant cities. What did you tell him? That I was going on an adventure too, that I'd bring him back stories. Otto's voice cracked. I'm bringing back nightmares instead. You don't know that. You might still go home. Stop. Otto looked at him. Please, don't give me hope. Hope is worse than despair. At least despair is honest. They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, artillery continued its rhythm. Inside, two men existed in the space between life and death, neither fully one nor the other. January 30th. Hans woke to silence. Real silence. No artillery, no gunfire, nothing. Otto. No response. Hans crawled over to where Otto sat slumped against the wall. He touched his shoulder. Otto's body was rigid, frozen. Hans stared at him for a long time. His mind felt blank. Empty. He should feel something. Grief. Loss. Fear. But there was nothing. Just observation. Otto was dead. Hans was alive. Both facts were equally meaningless. He pulled Otto's dog tags off, slipped them into his pocket. Then he took Otto's rifle and ammunition. One bullet left in the entire universe. Hans sat alone in the basement and waited. For death, for rescue, for anything. Time stopped meaning anything. He might have sat there for hours, might have been days. His mind disconnected from his body floating somewhere above the frozen ruins. Footsteps on the stairs. Hans raised his rifle. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold it. The footsteps got closer. Voices speaking Russian. Soviet soldiers appeared in the doorway. 4 of them. Young faces. Rifles pointed. Ruki Verk. Hans didn't understand the words, but understood the meaning. He lowered his rifle, raised his hands. The movement was slow mechanical, like watching someone else do it. The Soviets came forward carefully. One kicked his rifle away. Another patted him down. They found Otto's dog tags, found his notebook, took everything. Nemitz, one said, studying him. Skinny German. They pulled him to his feet. Hans's legs buckled. He hadn't stood in 3 days. 2 soldiers caught him, held him up. They led him outside. The daylight was blinding. Hans' squinted eyes watering. Around him, Stalingrad was silent. The artillery had stopped. The battle was over. Hundreds of German soldiers stood in the street. Thousands, maybe. All being herded together by Soviet troops. Some walked, some crawled. Some were carried by their comrades. Hans joined the column. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They'd survived the battle, only to face whatever came next. They marched east away from the city, away from the Volga, into captivity. The temperature was still -30. Men fell every few minutes. The column kept moving. Hans walked because walking was all he knew how to do. 1 foot in front of the other. Mechanical, mindless. He thought about Otto, about Klaus, about Werner and Schmidt and Vogel and all the others whose names he'd tried to forget. He thought about the girl he'd killed in September. Wondered if she had family. Wondered if they knew she was dead. Wondered if it mattered. He thought about his mother reading his letters in Cologne, believing he was coming home. He thought about promises he couldn't keep, and words that meant nothing, and a world that had forgotten how to be kind. Somewhere in the column someone started singing, an old folk song about fields and harvest and home. A few others joined in. Their voices were weak breaking, but they sang anyway. Hans couldn't sing. His throat was too dry. But he listened. And for just a moment, walking through the frozen wasteland with thousands of dying men, he felt something other than numbness. Not hope. Not quite. But something close. The stubborn, irrational insistence on remaining human, even when humanity seemed like the cruelest joke of all. The column marched on. Behind them, Stalingrad smoldered. Ahead, an uncertain future waited. And between the two men who should have been dead kept walking, kept breathing, kept existing, despite every reason not to. Freedom had come, but it wore a different uniform than anyone expected, and it had arrived far too late for the thousands who'd already disappeared into the white silence of a Russian winter. The march lasted 4 days. Or maybe 5. Hans lost count. Time had stopped working the way it used to. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into seconds. The only constant was cold and the sound of boots on frozen ground and the bodies left behind when men could no longer walk. On the second day, a German colonel collapsed beside Hans. Just stopped mid-step and fell. Hans kept walking. 2 Soviet guards dragged the colonel to the side of the road. A single gunshot followed. The column didn't slow down. On the third day, they passed through a village. Russian civilians lined the streets watching. An old woman spat at them. A child threw a rock. Hans didn't blame them. If the situation were reversed, he'd do the same. Worse, probably. On the 4th day, they reached a camp. Barbed wire, guard towers, wooden barracks that looked ready to collapse. The gates opened, and the column filed through. Someone counted them. Hans heard numbers shouted in Russian. 4,000 men. From an army of 270,000. 4,000. The arithmetic of extinction. They were herded into barracks. 50 men per building designed for 20. Hans found a spot against the wall and sat down. Around him men coughed, moaned, prayed. Some just sat silent, staring at nothing. A Soviet officer entered flanked by guards. He spoke German, accented but clear. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to international convention. You will work. You will obey. Those who cooperate will be fed. Those who resist will be shot." Someone raised their hand. A young lieutenant, maybe 25. "When can we write home? Our families need to know we're alive." The officer looked at him for a long moment. "Your families already know you're dead. The German government announced the destruction of the 6th Army on February 2nd. You are all officially deceased." The words landed like physical blows. Men started shouting, demanding. The guards raised their rifles. The shouting stopped. The officer continued. "In time, perhaps letters will be permitted. For now, survive. That is your only duty." He left. The barracks erupted in conversation, speculation, fear. Hans sat against the wall and felt nothing, dead to the world. It had made a strange kind of sense. He'd felt dead for weeks. Now it was just official. That night, Hans couldn't sleep. Around him, 49 men breathed in rhythm, a collective sound like wind through ruins. He thought about his parents reading his name in a newspaper. Killed in action. Died for Führer and fatherland. All the empty words. He thought about Otto's son Peter. 8 years old. 9 now, maybe. Being told his father was never coming home. Being told he died a hero. Hans pulled out Otto's dog tags from his pocket, held them in his palm. The metal was cold. He'd promised to find Otto's family, to tell them something. He couldn't remember what. The promise felt distant now, made by a different person in a different life. You can't sleep either. Hans looked up. An older man sat nearby, maybe 50, gray beard matted with ice. Hans had seen him in the column, but never spoken to him. No. Me neither. Haven't slept properly since November. The man extended his hand. Hauptmann Friedrich Weiss, or I was. Not sure rank means anything anymore. Hans shook his hand. Obergefreiter Hans Müller. Cologne. How did you know? Your accent. I'm from Dusseldorf. We're neighbors, relatively speaking. Weiss leaned back against the wall. You have family back home. Parents. You. Wife. 2 daughters, 12 and 14. Weiss's voice caught. They think I'm dead. Maybe that's better. How is that better? Because they've already grieved, already said goodbye. If we somehow survive this, if we somehow make it home, it'll be a gift. But if we don't, at least they've already moved on. Weiss stared at him. You're very young to be so cynical. I'm 23. I feel 80. I'm 52. I feel dead. Weiss pulled out a photograph, creased and water-stained. 2 girls in summer dresses smiling. This is Anna and Sophie. I haven't seen them in 2 years. By the time I get home, they'll be women. If I get home. Hans looked at the photograph. The girls looked happy, untouched by war. He wondered if they still looked like that, or if the war had reached them too. You'll see them again, Hans said, surprising himself. You think so? I don't know, but someone should. Someone should get home. Otherwise, what was the point of any of this? Weiss carefully folded the photograph and put it away. What about you? You have anyone waiting? Just my parents, and a promise I made to a friend. To find his family. Tell his son something. What did you promise to tell him? That his father thought about him every day. That he was sorry he couldn't come home. Hans paused. Standard things. Things that don't change anything but need to be said anyway. You'll tell him. When we get home, you'll find this family and you'll tell them. How do you know? Because you made a promise. And men like you keep their promises. It's written all over you. Hans wanted to believe him, wanted to think he was the kind of man who kept promises, but he'd broken so many already. Promises to himself, to his parents, to the girl he'd killed, though he'd never promised her anything. Maybe that was the worst promise of all, the one he'd broken without making. March came, then April. The prisoners worked, clearing rubble, building roads, digging graves for those who died each night. Hans worked mechanically, conserving energy, staying invisible. Invisible men survived longer. The rations improved slightly. Thin soup, black bread. Enough to stay alive, but not enough to feel human. Men still died. 20, 30 per week. Disease, starvation, despair. Hans stopped learning names. It was easier that way. In May, letters were finally permitted. 1 per month. 50 words maximum. Hans sat with a pencil and paper and tried to compress 3 months of hell into 50 words. Dear Mother and Father, I am alive. I am a prisoner in Russia. I don't know when I will come home. Please don't worry. I love you. Hans. 42 words. He stared at the remaining 8. What else could he say? That he'd watched friends die, that he'd killed people, that he wasn't the son they remembered. He left the 8 words blank and handed in the letter. Weiss sat beside him. What did you write? That I'm alive. Did you tell them where you are? The censors will remove it anyway. True. Weiss had written his own letter. I told my daughters I miss them, that I'm proud of them, that I'll be home soon. Will you? No. But they don't need to know that yet. More lies, more carefully crafted omissions. But maybe that was mercy. Maybe protecting people from truth was its own kind of love. Summer arrived. The camp became marginally more bearable, warmer at least. Men started talking about the future, about what they'd do when the war ended, when they went home. If they went home. Hans listened but didn't participate. The future felt fictional. Only the present was real. Only surviving the next day, the next hour, the next minute. One evening in July, a new batch of prisoners arrived. German soldiers from other pockets, other battles. They brought news. The Reich was losing. Allied forces had landed in Italy. The Soviets were pushing west. The war was turning. "We might actually survive this," Weiss said, watching the new prisoners file in. "The war might end before we all die here." "And then what?" Hans asked. "Then we go home." "To what?" "To cities that might not exist anymore. To families that have moved on. To a country that will call us cowards for surrendering. To life, Hans. We go home to life. That's enough." But Hans wasn't sure. He'd spent so long surviving that he'd forgotten what living meant, forgotten what it felt like to have purpose beyond continuing to breathe. That night, he pulled out his notebook. The last page. The one he'd saved. He'd carried it through Stalingrad, through the march, through 4 months of captivity. Now, he finally wrote on it. "To whoever finds this. My name is Hans Müller. I was 23 years old when I went to Stalingrad. I don't know how old I am now. I've lost count. I've lost so many things I can't list them all. But I'm still here, still breathing. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this survival. But I'm writing this so someone will know we existed. So someone will remember that we were men, not monsters. That we suffered. That we tried. That some of us, against all logic, refused to disappear." He signed it, folded it, hid it in his boot, pressed against his skin where the paper had been since Stalingrad. Evidence, testimony, proof. August 1945. A guard entered the barracks at dawn. "The war is over. Germany has surrendered." Silence. Then chaos. Men crying, laughing, embracing. Hans sat against the wall and felt nothing. The war had been over for him since January. This was just paperwork catching up. "We can go home," Weiss said, grabbing Hans's shoulders. "Do you understand? We can go home." "When?" "I don't know. Soon." They said soon. Soon turned into months. September, October, November. The wheels of bureaucracy ground slowly. Men were processed, questioned, sorted. Some were released, some remained. The criteria were opaque. December 1945. 3 years to the day since Hans had last celebrated Christmas in Stalingrad. He sat in the barracks with Weiss and 40 other men eating thin soup and black bread, and wondered if this would be his life forever. If he'd ever see anything but barbed wire and guard towers. "Müller! Hans Müller!" Hans looked up. A guard stood in the doorway with a clipboard. "Come with me." Hans stood on legs that barely worked. Weiss gripped his arm. "This is it. You're going home." "You don't know that." "I know. I can feel it." Weiss pulled him into an embrace. "Find Otto's family. Keep your promise. And live, Hans. Actually live, for all of us who can't." Hans nodded, unable to speak. He followed the guard out of the barracks across the compound, through a door he'd never seen open before. Inside, a Soviet officer sat behind a desk. He looked at Hans with something that might have been pity. "You are being released. You will be transported to the border and turned over to Allied authorities. From there, you will be repatriated to Germany." He slid a paper across the desk. "Sign here." Hans signed. His hand shook so badly he could barely form letters. "One more thing." The officer opened a drawer and pulled out a bundle. "These are your personal effects, confiscated upon arrival." Otto's dog tags, Hans's notebook, the pencil worn down to a stub. Hans took them with hands that didn't feel like his own. 3 days later, he stood at the German border. Behind him, Russia, and 3 years of captivity. Ahead, Germany, and whatever remained of his former life. The first thing he noticed was the silence. No guards shouting, no wire fences, just open space and freedom that felt more terrifying than imprisonment. A Red Cross worker approached him. Name? Hans Müller. She checked a list. You have family in Cologne. I did. They've been notified. Someone will meet you at the processing center. She handed him a bundle, clean clothes, a train ticket. Welcome home, soldier. The train ride took 2 days. Hans sat by the window and watched Germany pass by. Destroyed cities, burned fields, refugees walking endless roads. The country was a corpse, and he was returning to haunt it. Cologne appeared through the smoke, or what was left of it. The cathedral still stood damaged but defiant. Everything else was rubble. At the station, Hans stepped onto the platform. People moved around him, hurrying, purposeful. He stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process that he was actually here. Hans. He turned. His mother stood 20 meters away, older, grayer, but alive. Actual tears ran down her face. Hans, is that really you? He couldn't speak, could only nod. She ran to him, wrapped her arms around him, and he felt something crack inside. All the numbness, all the armor he'd built, it shattered. He started crying. For the first time since Klaus died, since Otto froze, since the girl in September, he cried. And his mother held him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Later in his childhood home, that somehow still stood among the ruins, Hans sat at the kitchen table. His father was there. Older too, quieter. They ate bread and soup and nobody mentioned the war. Finally his mother spoke. We thought you were dead. The letter came in February. Killed in action, it said. I almost was. What happened? Everything. Nothing. I don't know how to explain. His father reached across the table and took his hand. You don't have to. You're home. That's enough. But it wasn't enough. Hans could see it in their eyes. The questions they wouldn't ask. The horror they couldn't imagine. The distance that now existed between them. That night Hans lay in his childhood bed and stared at the ceiling. He should feel safe. Should feel relief. Instead, he felt like an imposter. Like he was pretending to be their son, while the real Hans had died in Stalingrad. In the morning, he made a decision. He pulled out Otto's dog tags and asked his father, Can you help me find an address? A family in Berlin. Ron. Their son's name was Peter. His father looked at the tags. Why? Because I made a promise. It took 3 weeks to locate them. The Ron family had moved after their apartment was bombed. They now lived in a suburb, in a small house they shared with another family. Hans stood outside for 10 minutes before knocking. His hand trembled. What would he say? How could he explain? A woman answered. 35, tired eyes. Otto's eyes. Can I help you? Are you Frau Ron? Yes. My name is Hans Müller. I served with your husband, Otto Ron. He asked me to... Hans couldn't finish. The words stuck in his throat. Understanding crossed her face. Not hope. Just sad recognition. Come in. Inside, a boy sat at a table doing homework. 9 years old. Dark hair. Otto's chin. Peter, Frau Ron said gently. This man knew your father. Peter looked up. His eyes were old. Too old for 9. Hans knelt down to Peter's level. He held out the dog tags. Your father wanted me to tell you something. He thought about you every day. Every single day. When everything was terrible, when everything was impossible, he thought about you. About taking you to the train station. About reading to you at night. He said you liked adventure stories. Peter took the tags with small hands. Did he die brave? Hans thought about Otto in that basement. Smoking his last cigarette. Confessing his sins. Refusing to quit. Yes, he died very brave. He never gave up. even when he had every reason to. He kept fighting because he wanted to come home to you. But he didn't come home. No, he didn't. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Peter held the dog tags against his chest. Thank you for telling me. Frau Rahn walked Hans to the door. Was it bad? At the end. Hans looked at her. He could lie. Could tell her Otto died quickly, painlessly. But she deserved truth. Yes, it was bad. But he wasn't alone. And he never forgot you. Either of you. She nodded, eyes wet. Thank you for keeping your promise. Hans walked home through the ruins of Berlin. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rubble. He thought about all the promises broken and kept. About the men who'd died and the few who'd survived. About the arbitrary nature of it all. That night he pulled out his notebook. The final page with his final words. He read them again, words written by someone who felt like a stranger now. Then he started a new notebook. Fresh pages. Clean paper. My name is Hans Müller. I survived Stalingrad. I don't know why. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this survival. But I will tell the story. I will remember the names. I will carry them forward because someone has to. Because if we forget, if we let these men disappear into history without testimony, then we've learned nothing. Then it could all happen again. He wrote through the night. About Klaus and his apple cake dreams. About Werner counting days on his fingers. About Schmidt walking into the cold. About Vogel choosing surrender. About Otto confessing his sins and singing folk songs in the dark. He wrote about the girl he killed. About her eyes. About how she'd looked young enough to be someone's sister. About how that moment had changed something fundamental inside him. He wrote about the arithmetic of extinction. 270,000 men. 4,000 survivors. The numbers that don't capture what it felt like to watch an army dissolve into snow. He wrote until his hand cramped, and the sun rose, and the new day arrived with all its ordinary demands. Years passed. Hans worked in his father's bookshop. Got married, had children. Lived a quiet life. But every year on January 31st, he went to the memorial that had been built in Cologne. A stone monument with names carved in granite. Names of men who'd died at Stalingrad. He'd read the names aloud, every single one he could remember. Klaus, Werner, Schmidt, Vogel, Koch, Bauer, Otto, and hundreds more, thousands more. And he'd tell anyone who would listen. Children on field trips, veterans on pilgrimage, tourists passing through. He'd tell them what happened. Not the strategic details, not the big picture history, but the small truths, the human truths. That war is fought by people, not numbers. That heroism and horror often wear the same uniform. That survival comes with debts that can never be fully repaid. In 1973, Hans received a letter from Weiss, from Friedrich Weiss, who'd sat beside him in that barracks and shown him photographs of his daughters. I made it home. Took 8 years, but I made it. Anna and Sophie barely recognized me. They were women by then, with lives I'd missed, but we rebuilt. We learned to be a family again. I'm writing because I wanted you to know. Someone should know. We didn't all disappear. Some of us made it. Thank you for keeping me sane when nothing made sense. Thank you for believing someone should get home. Friedrich. Hans kept the letter. Added it to his collection. Evidence. Testimony. Proof that some stories have endings beyond tragedy. On January 31st, 1983, exactly 40 years after the surrender, Hans stood at the memorial with his grandson. The boy was 7, same age Peter Rahn had been when his father marched east. Opa, why do we come here every year? Hans looked at the names carved in stone, looked at the fresh flowers people had left, looked at the old men gathered fewer each year, survivors bearing witness. Because remembering is resistance. Because if we forget what happened, if we let these men become just numbers in a history book, then we've learned nothing. And history that isn't learned from gets repeated. Were you scared? Every single day. Were you brave? Hans thought about that, about what bravery meant. I don't think I was brave. I think I was just too stubborn to die. But I knew men who were brave. Real brave. Men who kept their humanity when humanity seemed impossible. Those are the men we remember. The boy looked up at him. Will you tell me their names? Yes, I'll tell you all the names I can remember. And you'll remember them too. And maybe you'll tell your children. That's how we keep them alive. That's how we make sure they didn't disappear for nothing. Hans began. Klaus, 17 years old, from Hamburg. He liked apple cake. And under the gray German sky beside a stone memorial in a rebuilt city, the names rose like prayers, like promises kept, like resistance against forgetting. The men of the Sixth Army had marched east believing in glory. They'd found hell instead. Most never returned. But their stories survived, carried forward by the few who made it home, by the children and grandchildren who listened, by the simple, stubborn insistence that what happened mattered, that they mattered. If you believe their names deserve to be remembered, share this story. Write a name in the comments below. Keep them alive. Because memory is how we resist history's cruelest erasures. Because every name was a person. Every person had people who loved them. And love, even across decades and death, is the only victory we ever really win.